A lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that we do at the Risk Center is involving how people make decisions to prepare for hazards, whether it's an earthquake or a hurricane or also possibly, for example, a possible terrorist attack and so forth. And a lot of the work that I've been interested in and trying to do is try to figure out why people often make mistakes when doing these preparations. A lot of times when we have disasters, people come in after the fact and they say, well, if they had only done this, and why did people leave their cars in a flood zone when they were given all these warnings that floods were going to come in and so forth. And basically what we found, over a number of years and using a combination of field surveys and working with people in laboratories and so forth, is that effectively people kind of are subject to three major biases. Okay, well, one of which is, and simply put, there's a tendency to underappreciate the future or underconsider the future consequences. A second thing is to forget too quickly the past. That people are too quick to forget or too quick to remember or too slow to remember the events that have negative happens in the past. And the third one is if in doubt, what often happens is that people will follow the advice of other people who are no less prone to those sorts of mistakes than they are. So. A lot of which we're really interested in studying is why is it that people make these mistakes? Why is it that they don't consider the future enough? And why is it that they too quickly forget the past? And why is it that they just turn to other people if in doubt? Well, the main thing that we find is that often for a lot of hazards, people have really bad mental models, what we call them, of how things are going to unfold. So, for example, if a hurricane's coming, in order for you to make a decision about how to prepare for it, how many packs of batteries to get, or even whether or not I should evacuate, what you have to do is sort of mentally reconstruct how is this event going to unfold before me. Okay, how high is the water going to get? When the wind comes, how strong will the wind be? And what is it going to do to my house and so forth? And then what people have to do is sort of mentally simulate how this thing is going to unfold, and then based on that, make a decision about what's the right preparation to get. Like how many days am I going to need, be possibly without power? What we find out is that people often have very bad mental models. So they do that process very poorly. So often what happens is that what they think is going to happen is often very different from what actually does happen. So, for example, one of the things we found out in a lot of studies we did, of surveys we did of Hurricane Sandy when it was approaching the coast, was that people grossly underestimated a couple things. One of which is how long the after effects of the storm are going to be. Often in the media coverage, you would say, well, a hurricane's coming, a hurricane's coming, a hurricane is coming tonight. And people kind of draw from that the inference that the thing that they have to worry about is getting through the night. Okay, and they have these images of them sitting in their home and winds swirling all around, the roof blowing off and so forth. The reality is in Sandy, that was never really in the cards for most people. Okay, what was in the cards, particularly for people inland, was basically being without power for 2 weeks. Okay, and in that particular case, so people were all set to survive the night. They had enough beer and they had enough pizza and they had enough snacks to get them through the storm event, but they weren't really prepared for the 2 weeks afterwards. For example, we found out beforehand, we asked people, do you have plans of where you would go if you have to evacuate? And we found out that only 23% of people that were located right along the immediate coast, most in harm's way in Sandy, made plans for what they would do if they had to evacuate. One of the conclusions that we got from a lot of the Sandy work, for example, was just underscoring sort of how bad people's mental models were, was people that lived right along the coast really underestimated the degree to which the thing that they had to worry about was floods, not water damage, not necessarily wind damage. And in a lot of the advisories and the warnings coming in, they basically said, well, Hurricane Sandy's coming in. If you live on the coast, you should be worried about flooding and so forth. Because in some sense, flooding is the thing that kills people in hurricanes. Generally not wind, it's flood is the one that's worse. And yet when we talk to people that lived as close as 1/2 block from the water, and we asked them, what are you most worried about? What they ended up saying is wind. I'm worried about wind, when in fact water was the thing that they really had to worry about. And in fact, most of the deaths in New York City were due to people drowning from floods. In Hurricane Sandy, something like 250,000 cars were lost due to flooding. And it was all due, and these are all avoidable losses. People just simply had to move inland a little bit. People just simply had to move their cars into a little bit higher ground. But if you're thinking that what's going to worry about is wind, in fact, right, the proper thing to do is stay where you are. There's sort of an adage in hurricane preparation is you should flee from water, hide against the wind, and the idea is you should shelter in place given a windstorm. So what people were doing was sort of correct. If you think that wind is the one thing you have to worry about, you shouldn't leave. You should stay in your home, not go anywhere, keep your car right there. But on the other hand, what they were really facing was a big flood or water disaster, and they were prepared completely for the wrong thing. What they should have done is left, but they stayed. The basic problem is how do you get people to have a better mental model or be able to better mentally simulate what's going to happen to them so they can basically line up what's going to happen with them with how they're going to prepare for it. And right now, the real problem is that people aren't getting very specific information about what's going to happen to them at their house. One of the things we found, for example, is that when hurricanes approach, what people tend to do is even people that normally sit around the internet and get all their information and off of Twitter feeds and Facebook and so forth, what people tend to have a tendency to do is sit down and watch television, watch the Weather Channel, watch CNN, and what they're getting is a very monolithic view of what's going to happen to the storm. Then in particular, if you're living in coastal New Jersey, you will see a broadcaster sitting in Central Park, New York, or the Battery in New York, and so you're not getting a real clear sense as to what's happening to you personally. So one of the challenges is that, and I know that the National Hurricane Center and NOAA in generally is sort of trying to do this, is trying to find ways of communicating to people at specific locations what are the actual experiences that you're going to get. Another one, which is also a really tough one to overcome, is how do you get people to appreciate the threat that water places? Like, for example, one thing we find is that people tend not to buy flood insurance. Okay, people that live in a flood area don't buy it. Okay, and that's FEMA has a real tough time trying to convince people to buy flood insurance because it's something that they have a difficult time imagining. If you've been living in a place for a long time, you've never seen water, the idea that you might your house might be underwater someday is a thing which is very, very difficult to imagine. And this is particularly the case in hurricanes where usually when we talk about hurricanes, you naturally think of a windstorm. And in fact, the National Hurricane Center grades the severity of storms based on their category. And the category is tied to wind speed. So it's a Cat 2 or a Cat 3. And so in the case of, so what happens is when people think of hurricanes, they naturally think hurricanes mean wind, categories mean wind, and they don't really think so much about water effects. And so one of the real challenges is how do you get that across to people and how do you try to correct for that? So, for example, a lot of the forecasts will say something like, when this storm comes in, there could be a 10-foot storm surge. Okay, but then you have to ask people, how many people know how high up off sea level their house is? No one knows that. Okay, so it's hard to make the connection between that and what their personal impacts are going to be. So that's a real challenge. And so I think that one of the things to do would be for NOAA and is thinking about doing this is try to put ways of in their forecasts actually de-emphasizing the attention which is given to the damage which is caused by wind and really focus a whole lot more on the personal damage that can happen through flooding, and which is a thing that tends to be underestimated. Another thing that often happens is that when people are unsure what to do in a situation and they don't know which of several actions to take, often what people do is they fall back to what psychologists call default biases. And that is, if you don't know what to do, just do the thing that's easiest or the thing that you've been used to doing. So if you think about it in the context of preparations, what's the default bias? Well, it's to do nothing. It's just to stay at home. It's not to go out and buy extra supplies and things like that. So and often people kind of worry about, well, what if I take precautions and nothing happens? Like if I go out and they say I should fill up my whole house with water, okay, and I should get 5 cases of water to last me for 2 weeks. And people are thinking through, well, how long am I going to be without water? Well, they tell me 2 weeks, but it could be 2 days. And I remember a time in the past or last year when the storm came in and nothing happened. And after a while, you just can't really make up a decision. And so what ends up happening is people do nothing. Okay, and so one of the possibilities is to think about ways of making preparation or making precautions to be the default action rather than being the effortful action. So, for example, one of my colleagues at the WIS Center is sort of advocating one way to get people to make sure they renew their flood insurance is when you buy a home, and if it's in a flood-prone area, that to make it like part of the mortgage, so that every year you kind of naturally have to renew it, and it's not a decision you have to consciously make. Or one idea that I've had is that part of your property taxes in a given year, you automatically pay for a hurricane protection kit in hurricane-prone areas where the community comes by and drops off a protection kit for you. And then if you want, they'll give you your money back if you don't want it. And so therefore you have to consciously think, rather than default being whether to take action, the default is whether to not take action. And I think that people would more inclined to you'd be led to safety under that circumstance. To me, what's really interesting about work, and although a lot of the work just by convenience happens to be focused on hurricane preparation because it's something we can study quite frequently, a lot of the biases that we observe in the context of why people make mistakes preparing for hurricanes are really observed in a wide variety of other contexts. For example, consider protection against terrorism. There's a great image that I think that going back to the 9/11 tragedies, there's this famous picture of Mohammed Atta breezing by security at the Portland airport, and you see this image of Mohammed Atta streaming by, and there's an attendant who's basically kind of like this at the counter, basically letting this person go through. And one of the difficulties there, it sort of epitomizes one of the real problems that occur in trying to make protections to prepare against events that occur with very, very low frequency, but when they do happen, have incredibly dramatic consequences. Is that most of the time we're reinforced for not doing anything. Okay, that the number of times that we're taking a lot of effortful action to protect against something, the number of times that you're ever actually going to encounter the disaster is very, very rare. So you can think, for example, for someone who's an airport screener, how often do they actually see a terrorist coming through? It almost never happens. And most of the time, there's a natural tendency, we learn by trial and error, and most of the time, every time you put out this little effort that says, let me work harder, let me try to think harder, let me put up more protection, let me prepare for the storm, or let me put out more effort to be more vigilant against a possible terrorist attack. Every time you put all that effort, most of the time it's not going to be rewarded. Most of the time it's going to be effort for nothing. And that's often why people, for example, cancel flood insurance, because most of the time when they buy their flood insurance, they write out a big check for it, no flood. Next year they write out another big check, no flood. And all of a sudden they're thinking, wow, I could have used that money to buy a good TV. It could have been for really good purposes, and I'm wasting it on flood insurance. That, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, to go back another hurricane example, which was very vivid in the press in terms of all the flooding that happened in New Orleans, there was a significant increase in number of people nationwide who bought flood insurance. What was interesting is within 1 year after Hurricane Katrina, all of a sudden about a large proportion of those people canceled their flood insurance again because they didn't see a reward associated with that. And that's the type of thing which basically it kind of occurs all over the place. Another one is this idea of people being unable to foresee the personal consequences of something. That, for example, and I think ultimately one bias that occurs is people tend to suffer what psychologists call an optimistic bias. And the optimistic bias is the sense that you recognize that there's some hazard out there and there's a really good chance that it can occur, but the tendency is to think that when it does occur, the real harm is going to be to somebody else. It's not going to be to me. So, for example, I think every parent who's had their teenagers start to drive, you'll give them a stern warning: never text and drive, never text and drive. But you kind of know that the teenager is going to. They realize they understand that what the dangers are, but somehow or another there's an instinct that says, yeah, that's going to happen, but it's not going to happen to me. I'm going to be the careful one. It's going to happen to someone else. And all of a sudden, what ends up happening is then you have sort of the accident, and hopefully it's not a tragic consequence. And we see this sort of robustly across a wide variety of different areas. For things like terrorist attacks and wildfires, earthquakes, hurricanes, you name the disaster, I think it's also reinforcing the fact that how is it that people learn the consequences of these things? Well, they don't learn them from things that have personally bad happen to them, but they learn about them from seeing images of these things happening other places. So, for example, when a hurricane's coming in, or if I'm worried about an earthquake, I've never seen an earthquake at my house, but I've seen a lot of earthquakes over in Chile. I've seen a lot of earthquakes in China, and that's where earthquakes occur. Okay, and so therefore, I'm worried about earthquakes, but when it does happen, I know where it's going to happen. It's not going to be at my house. It's going to be in, far up in the North Bay area. It's going to happen in Chile. It's going to happen in Japan or in China. I think we're actually a lot closer to that than, because certainly right now, the combination of high-resolution satellite elevation data and block-by-block information, that certainly the data are out there, that basically emergency planners do know that if a tide was to come up to a certain level, they exactly know what will happen at a particular house. They really have that information. And we have an awful lot of data like that. One of the problems is how do you get that information and get it down to at least an individual who personally, so that they kind of see the personal relevance. And I think with apps, with smartphone technology, I think that we're not that far away. I think that often people may not respond to a generic message that says, everyone in West Philadelphia should do this, okay? Because when you're thinking about what's going to happen, you're going to think, well, it's not me in West Philadelphia, it's this other person in West Philadelphia. Their house is the one that's going to be in danger. But on the other hand, if I get a message that basically says, me, Robert Meyer, this is a dedicated message for you, that this is what's going to happen at your house at your particular address, suddenly that takes on, I can identify with that information a whole lot more, and I understand it's not a generic message, but it's speaking to me directly. So I would like to think that we're actually much closer to that than you might think. The real challenge in trying to figure out how do you get better communication messages and how do you study how people make preparation for disasters and so forth is that there are not a lot of opportunities to study that in the real world. Fortunately, we're not into a situation where NOAA is going to run a controlled experiment where let's not warn some people and let's warn some other people and see what happens. We can't do that. So one of the things that I've been involved in, a research group that I'm involved in, is developing very realistic simulations in which a person is put into a virtual living room and you have the opportunity to go turn on the television. You can go to the web. You can go out, leave the house and talk to neighbors and so forth. And the goal is that in the context of these simulations, they can experience what, for example, would be a virtual hurricane coming in over a period of time, and they get to watch the news the feeds as they change, all done hypothetically. And the great thing about that is we can use that as a natural laboratory for testing. Well, how would people's decisions in this realistic simulated environment be altered if we gave them different kinds of messages, or if the tone of the TV broadcast was a little bit different, or what happens if the people that they talked to were experts versus novices with respect to hurricanes? These are sorts of things we can't run these controlled experiments in the field. The one thing that we've discovered, though, is one of the natural reservations that you might have is, well, there's a real difference between sitting in a computer lab and responding to a hypothetical hurricane threat versus actually experiencing a hurricane or experiencing a real earthquake. But what we find surprisingly is that the way in which people behave in these two environments is remarkably similar. That if you design these simulations realistically enough, all their natural instincts for what they do when these things come in kick in. So, for example, when we had the simulation where you put in this virtual living room, our worry was that people would just try all different sorts of things in the living room that they wouldn't naturally do just because it's a simulation. But what we found, for example, was that in these hurricane simulations, that what people tended to do was just turn on the TV. Okay, and that's exactly what they do in real life. And actually, surprisingly, they didn't do some of these things. So when we could kind of correlate the utilization of media in the simulation with the utilization in the field, which we observe in our hurricane studies, there's a remarkable parallel. And we see a lot of the same biases coming up in one or the other. So that gives us a lot of optimism that, in fact, we can start doing testing of communication vehicles and so forth in the lab, which hopefully we can take in the real world. Like, for example, you gave the example of, can we do better individual targeting of impacts? Well, one of the things we can do in our simulations is they have a table that they can look at, and there's a cell phone sitting on the table, and they can pick up the cell phone. And one of the things we can do is manipulate the type of message that's in that cell phone. We're basically going to continue on a lot of what we're doing. One of the things that we're actually interested in lately, which is sort of which is a front burner item for a lot of people, not only for people in hazard preparation, but also for people in businesses, is how people are going to respond to climate change. And a lot of the scientists are really uncertain as to how this will affect, for example, hurricane impacts, frequency of tornadoes, droughts, and so forth. But I think there is a general feeling that things will be different in the future than they are now. And a lot of this mitigation against climate change is something which requires both individuals and communities to make very large, long-term investments in protection. Like, for example, New York City after Sandy is thinking about, well, what can we do to protect against sea level rise? And the problem with sea level rise is the type of thing where, in order to protect against it, you're talking about not just putting up some sandbags, but you're talking about major multi-billion-dollar investments in infrastructure, which are things which people don't really like, communities don't like to do. And unfortunately, it's the type of thing when you look at the budget in a given year, you say, well, we want to do it. Okay, we want to be safe, but in some sense, we don't really have the money to do it this year. We'll put it off to next year. And then next year becomes the year after, and the next year becomes after that. And then eventually, suddenly, there's another Sandy comes in, and there's another flood, and so forth. And so one of the things we're interested in studying is how is it that people and communities will adapt to climate change, in particular sea level rise and so forth, and what are types of messages and types of things that you can do to get people to see the benefits of investments today against something that's really long term, that in fact you may never even see the benefits of in your lifetime. And that, as hard as it is to get people to take actions to prepare against immediate threats like hurricanes, as you might imagine, getting people to see the benefits in taking protections against sea level rise or global warming is much, much harder. But that's sort of the big thing that's on our plate now.